"I told everybody I was gay. I said I was the originator. I think I was the first one of them." The interviewer pushed back, reminding him that people always saw his records as extremely sexual. "Is that a problem for you? Or are you talking more about the profanity?" He answered calmly, almost bored. "Sexuality ain't bad." That one short exchange framed the question nobody wanted to say out loud. James Brown wasn't just the godfather of funk. He was the embodiment of black male power in America, rigid spine, iron jaw, and a public image that refused to bend. Strong, relentless, absolutely uncompromising. But behind closed doors, it was said that James Brown openly despised 7 prominent gay black male singers. 7 names big enough that just hearing them in the same sentence as his could make a room go quiet. So who were the men that pushed the godfather of soul past his limit? Was his fury driven by pure prejudice, by artistic rivalry, or by something darker, hidden pressures, secret fears, and backstage truths from American show business that were never meant to reach the public record? This file opens those locked drawers. It follows the trail of those 7 names James Brown allegedly hated most, and the shadow they cast on the legacy of funk. At the top of the list, one name always burned hotter than the rest. Not because he wasn't talented, but because everything about him seemed designed to provoke James Brown. 1. Prince, the audacious genius. Among the artists James Brown reportedly could not stand, Prince was the one who drove him the closest to rage. Not because of one song or one insult, but because Prince's every gesture, every outfit, every little act of defiance felt like it was stripping James of his right to be the uncontested godfather of funk. According to people who were there, that quiet war began in 1982. James was in a studio in Georgia when he first saw the cover of Prince's 1999 album, a black man in heavy eyeliner, lace shirt, bare chest, clutching a guitar like he was seducing his own reflection. Witnesses claimed James stared at the cover, then flung the magazine onto the studio floor. He allegedly turned to his assistant and snapped, "What the hell is this? Funk turned into a toy for these gender benders?" That, they said, was the first time James Brown spoke Prince's name with open contempt, and it was also the first moment he felt truly threatened. Not by the music itself, but by the audacity to redefine what a black male artist could look like. Still, the real explosion didn't happen until August 1983. That night, James Brown hosted a grand show at the Beverly Theater in Los Angeles. The house was packed, cameras rolling, the atmosphere electric. Brown was in full command, the patriarch of funk presiding over his kingdom. At the height of the show, he called Michael Jackson to the stage. Michael, soft-spoken and respectful, came out, embraced James, smiled, and played to the crowd. It was a perfect moment, 2 black legends, 2 eras, sharing one spotlight. Then Michael did something no one warned James about. Into the microphone, he pointed into the audience and said, "Prince, come up here with me." James froze. In a single instant, the stage that had always belonged to him became contested ground. According to those who watched from the wings, Prince emerged from backstage not like a guest, but like the headliner. He walked slowly, almost lazily, as if it were his own tour. No bow to James, no formal greeting, no sign of deference to the man whose music had paved the road he was walking on. Prince allegedly grabbed a guitar from a band member, tuned it right there in front of everyone, and began to play. Not quite in rhythm, not fully in key, not blending into the song, just shards of screeching, swaggering notes that felt, to James, like a slap across the face in his own house. The audience looked confused. Michael seemed awkward, caught in the middle of a storm he hadn't meant to start. Prince played a few lines, then, as witnesses recalled, calmly set the guitar down, turned his back, and walked off stage without even glancing at James Brown. The next day, according to people close to him, James shattered a television in his backstage room. "I let a viper in," he reportedly roared at his manager. From that moment on, he refused to use Prince's name. He allegedly referred to him only as "that weirdo." When Prince released Purple Rain in 1984, the gap between them widened into a chasm. The song, Darling Nikki, with its explicit story of a woman masturbating in a hotel lobby, triggered outrage across the country. Parents' groups protested. Some states pushed to have the album restricted. Prince didn't back down. In interviews, he insisted it was art, sexual freedom, expression. James Brown, according to family accounts, clutched his Bible and muttered through clenched teeth, "That's sick garbage." Years earlier, he had survived periods when his own songs were banned from radio for being too wild, too raw, too black. Now he watched what he saw as an eccentric kid being praised for turning masturbation into a pop anthem. To James, that wasn't progress. It was a reversal of the moral order. By 1987, some people around James said he wanted to make peace. He reportedly came up with an idea, a mini tour featuring 3 generations of funk: James Brown, the originator; George Clinton, the psychedelic pioneer; and Prince, the modern face of the genre. His team sent an invitation through Prince's management. Weeks passed. Silence. When an assistant finally called Paisley Park directly, Prince's camp supposedly gave a blunt answer. "Prince isn't interested." James slammed his hand on the table. To him, people say, that was the ultimate insult. No formal decline, no respectful refusal, just dismissal. From then on, James stopped trying to decode Prince. He allegedly called him an egomaniac, a black-skinned misfit, a traitor to the spirit of funk. By 1993, when Prince changed his name to an unpronounceable symbol, the divide felt permanent. James scoffed, according to those who were with him. To him, Prince was no longer a musician, but something hovering between performance art and madness. When Prince later wrote "slave" on his face and accused record labels of modern-day enslavement of artists, James reportedly shook his head. "He thinks he's a victim, living in a castle," James was said to have muttered. Meanwhile, James carried memories of actual segregation, real police batons, real doors slammed in his face. Prince, in his view, was playing out a script in a movie he'd written for himself. But what allegedly disgusted James most didn't come from the stage. It came from Prince's private life. In 1996, Prince and his wife, Mayte Garcia, had their first child. According to reports, the baby, often referred to as Gregory in some accounts, was born with a rare illness and died after only a few days. There was no public funeral, no official announcement, no public mourning. Those close to the situation claimed that Prince chose silence, erasing almost every trace, as if the child had never existed. When word reached James, witnesses say he went quiet for a long time. Then he murmured, "Burying your child in silence, no grief, no farewell. That man has no heart." To him, that wasn't just questionable behavior. It was a sign that the moral compass had snapped. In his later years, James Brown never once called Prince an artist in private conversations, according to insiders. He omitted Prince from lists of inspirations, refused every proposal to remix or blend their music. Whenever producers suggested including Prince in a project, James reportedly gave the same answer: "Funk doesn't need its traitors." When Prince died in 2016, some in the media expected a statement from the Brown family. None came. No tribute, no official comment. Because for James Brown, at least in the stories told by those who knew him, the Prince he could never forgive had already died long before. He died, in James's memory, the night he stepped onto that Los Angeles stage in 1983 and refused to bow. From that point on, Prince existed in James Brown's mind as something else entirely, the most dangerous eccentric ever to walk into the world of funk. A living, breathing challenge to everything James thought a black male artist should be. But Prince was not the only nightmare. To James Brown, he was just a rich weirdo. The next name on his list made him feel something far darker, as if funk itself were slipping into the hands of evil. 2. Sylvester. From the choir loft to the wildest party in town, James Brown liked to say he didn't need to scream to prove he was a man. But what he never imagined was that one day a black man in a dress would walk onto a stage, open his mouth, and make entire crowds rise to their feet, screaming his name in worship. That man was Sylvester. In James Brown's private universe, black men didn't cry in public. They didn't wear lipstick. They didn't walk in heels. And they certainly didn't float across a funk groove with a voice as light as perfume. To James, funk was power. Funk was a hammer, not a feather. It was the drum beat thundering up from a man's chest, not a high, shimmering falsetto gliding over sequins and mirror balls. Then Sylvester arrived. Sequined gowns, towering wigs, dangling earrings that sparkled under club lights, a falsetto that floated like smoke over the dance floor. What James feared the most wasn't just what Sylvester looked like. It was the way audiences fell in love with that defiance, how willingly they embraced a version of black manhood that, in his eyes, had been turned inside out. At first, from a distance, James watched with a kind of stunned curiosity, then suspicion, and slowly, that curiosity hardened into pure, cold anger. When Sylvester's album featuring You Make Me Feel Mighty Real broke into the Billboard Top 40 Inches 1978, James knew this wasn't a passing joke. This wasn't a novelty act. This was a new kind of icon. But to him, it was an icon that mocked the soul of black people. There was another layer most outsiders never saw. James Brown didn't just resent Sylvester for wearing dresses. What truly burned him was that white America seemed to reward Sylvester precisely for dressing like a woman. In magazine profiles and TV spots from the 1970 seconds, white journalists reportedly called Sylvester the Black David Bowie, the disco diva, a strange gift from the church to the dance floor. To James, that language wasn't praise. It was a taunt. He had spent nearly a decade and a half fighting to make white audiences stop treating him like a sideshow, the crazy dancer, the wild black man. Yet, here was Sylvester, being hailed as seductive and exotic simply because he blurred gender lines. Then the story started. On the 12th of January 1977, police investigated Sylvester in connection with a suspected drug den in San Francisco's Castro district. No one ended up convicted, but witnesses allegedly told officers that Sylvester was a regular at parties where ecstasy was scattered like candy and where group sex was the unspoken final act after every song. Later that same year, he was reportedly arrested on suspicion of stealing an antique coin collection from the home of a former lover after the man supposedly caught Sylvester in bed with a new partner. The case never reached trial, and it was widely believed to have been settled quietly out of court. James knew all of this. He didn't have to hire detectives. The black music world back then was small enough that rumors traveled faster than a tour bus. James Brown was no saint. He had his own arrest record, his own violence, his own chaos. But in his mind, his sins were manly, ugly, brutal, but aligned with the code he believed in. What Sylvester represented, in James's eyes, was something else entirely. Not just excess, but contamination. The disgust turned into a personal wound when James learned that one of his own dancers, Ricky Campbell, had left the James Brown camp to join Sylvester's backing band. On the cover of an underground gay magazine, Ricky appeared in a swimming pool, wearing a bikini, wrapped around Sylvester with a dazed, dreamy look in his eyes. James didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Just seeing that image was enough. According to those close to him, he immediately fired 2 other crew members who had been friendly with Ricky. For James, someone who had once shared his stage and carried his rhythm, now embracing a man in a dress, felt like treason. A betrayal he couldn't wash off. As Sylvester's fame grew, the anger deepened. When Sylvester began performing at legendary clubs like Studio, 54 Inches New York, and Paradise Garage spaces where white elites, fashion models, and gay revelers mixed in the dark, James saw it as an invasion. Those rooms had once been sacred battlegrounds for funk and soul. Now, in his mind, they were being turned into theaters for soft bodies, suggestive dances, and defiant stares. To James, that wasn't a concert. It was a provocation. In 1983, Sylvester was invited to perform at the official New York Pride celebration. It was the first time an openly gay black artist took center stage at that event. When James heard, he called his tour manager and demanded a venue change for his own upcoming show in nearby New Jersey. His explanation was simple and cutting. "I'm not playing near where that guy is singing." From that point forward, every invitation that came from festivals or events connected to LGBTQ+ audiences or gender-diverse communities was turned down on sight. James didn't want any overlap. any confusion, any hint that his brand of funk had something in common with Sylvester, whom he privately likened to a virus that could spread with a single look. By 1988, Sylvester was dying from AIDS-related complications. His funeral became a landmark moment for queer culture. The coffin was open. He wore a red kimono. Disco tracks echoed through the space. Hundreds of queer people who had lived in the shadows, been beaten, mocked, and cast out, came to say goodbye to someone who had dared to live exactly the way they dreamed of living. James Brown did not attend. To the wider world, Sylvester had become a disco icon. To black queer communities, he was a pioneer, almost a saint. But in James Brown's private legend, Sylvester sat at the opposite end of the scale, an anti-saint, a lewd puppet dressed up as an artist. History may record both men as legends. But if the stories from James's inner circle are to be believed, one thing never changed for him. He didn't despise Sylvester because Sylvester failed to be a man. He despised him because the world dared to celebrate him as an artist. 3. Little Richard, the genius who switched identities like changing clothes. On one tour stop in Paris, James Brown stood under the hot stage lights, stared out at a mostly white audience, and shouted, "This is real black man's music." The crowd roared. But deep inside, James knew that long before he planted his flag, someone else had stormed that same territory and blown apart every rule about what a real black man was supposed to look like. That someone was Little Richard. He was a pioneer of rock and roll, the spiritual father of Elvis Presley and Prince. And yet, according to James Brown's own private mythology, the same man who had allowed, in his view, funk and black music to be tainted by what James saw as a twisted, uncontrollable lifestyle. The roots of James's hatred supposedly reached back further than anyone outside his circle realized. It began around 1950. Little Richard was just 16. Back then, in Macon, Georgia, a town where the church was law and faith ruled every corner, Richard would reportedly slip into his mother's dresses, smear on cheap lipstick, and walk down the street like he was already starring in his own show. In that world, such behavior wasn't just unusual, it was a cultural crime. His father, Bud Penniman, a stern man who ran a club and sold bootleg liquor, saw it as a humiliation. According to later accounts, he beat Richard so brutally that the boy said he wanted to die. Then Bud threw him out of the house, calling him a disgrace who had dishonored the family name. In June 1950, Richard finally left home for good. He drifted around the outskirts of Atlanta and eventually joined Sugarfoot Sam's Minstrel Show, a drag-heavy traveling troupe that blurred the line between comedy, cabaret, and burlesque. On that stage, he put on a new identity. He called himself Princess Lavon. He wore gowns, danced to jazz, planted kisses on male audience members in exchange for tips, and slowly became known in the underground as the black boy who sings like a girl. James Brown, just 17 at the time, and singing gospel in Toccoa, Georgia, heard the whispers. He didn't have to meet Little Richard to form an opinion. The name The Freak, as some in the community called him, who smeared their skin color with scandal, was already burned into James's memory. But his disgust crystallized in 1955. That October, according to police records and local reports, Little Richard was arrested in Macon for indecent behavior, specifically for being caught watching other people have sex in a parked car in a public lot. He spent only 3 days in jail, but the story spread through town like a virus. Even worse, Richard later admitted in interviews that he liked watching people make love. He insisted he didn't take part, only observed. "I was Richard the Watcher," he said. From that point on, James Brown never referred to him as an artist in private conversation, according to those close to him. In James's eyes, Little Richard wasn't a legend. He was a pervert wearing sequins. The scandals layered on. In 1957, at the height of his rock and roll fame, Little Richard abruptly announced that he was quitting music to follow religion. During a flight from Sydney, he claimed he saw a fireball streak across the sky and took it as a warning from God that the end was near. He enrolled at Oakwood College, a Christian school. He cut his hair, dropped the drag, gave up the stage costumes, He declared himself a minister, became a vegetarian, got baptized, and told the world he was done with sin. But only a few months later, when the money dried up and the applause faded, he went back to the casinos and nightclubs. He returned to the stage in Las Vegas, performing again, the same man who had once sworn he would sing only for the Lord. To James Brown, who prided himself on discipline, even when he failed to live up to it, this was unforgivable. In his mind, it was proof that Little Richard was not just unstable, but hollow. A turncoat. A fraud. James reportedly told his band, "Don't trust that guy. He changes his gender like he changes underwear." Then came 1962. Richard was arrested again, this time at the Long Beach bus terminal, allegedly for spying on someone using a public restroom. He wasn't convicted, but the headlines screamed all the same. A former star, once more caught watching in public. The Black Baptist community was furious. Many churches banned him from preaching. But according to former bandmates and people around him at the time, Little Richard's private life only grew more chaotic. Behind closed doors, he allegedly hosted what some called music-directed orgies, sex parties choreographed to the beat, where the soundtrack mattered as much as the bodies. It was said that he sometimes ordered his own band members to masturbate in front of him so he could test their energy, as if they were instruments needing to be tuned. James Brown, hearing these stories, was stunned into silence. Then, witnesses recalled, he simply said, "I shared a tour with him in '57, never again." Indeed, in 1957, James had stepped in to replace Little Richard on several summer tour dates when Richard suddenly walked away from rock and roll to chase his religious calling. The crowds applauded James. He felt honored. For a brief moment, he seemed to step into the path Richard had just abandoned. But when Little Richard came back strutting onto stages in glittering outfits, drenched in makeup, pounding out Tutti Frutti, including its once-censored obscene lyrics in private performances, James's patience snapped. He reportedly came close to leaving music altogether, sick of the idea that his art, his funk, could be lumped into the same category as what he saw happening on Richard's stage. In the 1,980 seconds, Little Richard kept confusing audiences and churchgoers alike. On the 4th of May 1982, during an appearance on Late Night with David Letterman, he announced, "I'm not gay anymore. I'm omnisexual." Then, in a 1995 Penthouse interview, he admitted, "I've always known I was gay." Each time he flipped his story, traditional black audiences already torn between church values and secular fame felt their dignity being toyed with. For James Brown, this wasn't just about sexuality. It was about never taking a stand, never being clear, always playing both sides. He once summarized Little Richard this way, according to those who heard him talk in private. He wants to be a man when there's money, a woman when he wants love. He wants everything, but takes responsibility for nothing. So, even though Little Richard paved the road first, even though he laid down the early bricks of rock and roll that countless others walked on, James Brown refused to acknowledge him. In his mind, Little Richard was a drag performer held up by white audiences as a spectacle, used to turn funk and black music into a joke they could laugh at and still claim to love. And perhaps more than anything else, what James Brown could never stomach was this. No matter how chaotic Little Richard's private life seemed, no matter how twisted, contradictory, or scandalous his story became, the world still called him a legend. And that, James Brown could never forgive. Not in life, and not in death. 4. Rick James, the gifted eccentric and the terrifying hotel nights. If James Brown treated the stage like a sacred altar, Rick James treated it like the entrance to an all-night club that never closed. And from the very beginning, that was why James's contempt for him ran so deep. On the 17th of November, 1979, after a show in St. Louis, Rick James was accused of raping a 15-year-old girl in a hotel room. According to reports, she claimed Rick forced drugs on her, then assaulted her for hours before hotel staff finally escorted her out. The case never went to trial. It was believed to have ended in a quiet settlement. But the tabloids caught the scent and branded him with a new nickname, the real-life super freak. James Brown heard the news while staying at the Palmer House Hotel in Chicago. Relatives later recalled that he hurled a coffee cup against the wall, porcelain exploding on impact, before he said just one sentence: "I told you, that man doesn't make music, he hurts people with music." To James, Rick wasn't just an unruly child of funk. He was the one dragging it face first through the mud. James had spent years building a careful public mask of moral authority, even while his own private life burned with violence and excess. Rick, on the other hand, ripped the mask clean off. He flaunted everything: sex, drugs, and acts so bizarre most people wouldn't even believe them if they were written in a script. From the early 1980 seconds, Rick James earned a backstage nickname, the Funk Priest. Not because of his musicianship, but because of the way he allegedly conducted post-show ceremonies. According to people who claimed to be there, dancers, road crew, underage female fans, and even guest performers were sorted into categories: those who could be touched, those who had to serve, those who would only be watched. Everything was said to be filmed, cataloged, and sometimes used later as leverage, a twisted kind of insurance policy to keep the inner circle obedient. At a Miami party in 1982, Rick reportedly stood in the middle of a private suite and declared, "I'm the only man who can sleep with 3 genders and still get up and do a show like nothing happened." That boast reached James Brown through the grapevine after a summer tour. He wasn't just sickened by the arrogance. He was furious that white media outlets treated Rick as some kind of cultural rebel, a wild, stylish eccentric, instead of the destructive presence James believed he was. The higher Rick James climbed, the quieter James Brown became in public. But in private contracts, his anger was written in ink. Starting around 1983, a special clause appeared in James's performance agreements: no sharing a stage or backstage area with Rick James, and no shared billing with any artist closely linked to him. The rivalry escalated in 1984. On a television show, Rick James mocked James Brown's persona. He strutted out in a fake curly wig, shouted a distorted imitation of "I Feel Good," and howled like a caricature. The clip traveled quickly through the funk community. Everyone knew exactly who he was mocking. James didn't answer on television. He didn't need to. From then on, he referred to Rick in private with a single chilling phrase: "That bastard who wears music." But the worst scandal was still waiting. On the 2nd of August 1991, Rick James and his girlfriend, Tanya Hijazi, were arrested at the Street James Hotel in West Hollywood. They were accused of detaining, beating, and sexually assaulting a woman over a period of 6 days. According to court documents and press coverage, the victim was tied up, forced to take drugs, burned with cigarette butts, and repeatedly assaulted. The media called it one of the most brutal cases of sexual violence the funk world had ever seen. By 1994, Rick James was sentenced to prison, facing years behind bars. When the verdict flashed across the evening news, James Brown, already an aging legend by then, watched from his studio in Augusta. Family members said he didn't speak for nearly 20 minutes. Then he nodded, once slow, deliberate, like a man watching a prophecy fulfilled. For him, this wasn't just another celebrity downfall. It was proof, he believed, that the darkness he'd sensed from the beginning had finally been dragged into the light. People could argue that Rick James was a wildly talented showman, an icon who helped shape an entire generation of funk-infused pop. They could say his grooves lived forever, on radio, in clubs, in samples. But in James Brown's private gospel, none of that mattered. When he looked at Rick James, he didn't see a pioneer. He saw the man who turned the stage into a brothel, the man who turned funk, his life's work, into something dirty, diseased, and in need of cleansing. 5. Billy Preston, the polished face of the fifth Beatle. If James Brown believed funk was the final, pure symbol of black male strength, then one question haunted him. What do you do with a black musician who plays the organ like a miracle, shares stages with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but offstage carries a trail of sex scandals, drug addiction, and whispered stories about boys? For James Brown, that question had one answer. His name was Billy Preston. To the public, Billy was a musical prodigy, the man some people called the fifth Beatle. To James Brown, he was something else entirely. A dangerous soft presence, a smiling mask, a man who should never have been allowed near the heart of funk. On stage, Billy Preston could hide almost everything. But in James Brown's eyes, he couldn't hide the one thing James claimed he recognized instantly, the kind of man white America felt safe around. They first crossed paths in the 1,970 seconds at a charity concert in Detroit. Backstage, Billy appeared in a purple suit, gemstone rings flashing under the light, his afro thick and perfectly shaped. He smiled gently, a calm, almost saintly calm, and when he sat at the organ, his fingers didn't attack the keys, they caressed them. That was enough for James. He leaned toward his assistant and murmured, "That's the kind of man who makes white men feel safe. And that's why he's more dangerous than Rick James." To James, the danger wasn't just in Billy's sound. It was in the split between the smooth, church-trained image and the stories that started leaking out later, stories that, in James's mind, pulled a dark curtain over everything Billy had ever played. On the 21st of June, 1991, Billy Preston was arrested in Los Angeles. According to LAPD reports, he faced charges of battery and sexual assault involving an underage boy he had met at a group prayer session. Authorities claimed the boy was taken back to Billy's home under the innocent cover of music lessons. He reportedly left in a state of shock, bruised, terrified, and shaking. Billy did not admit guilt. His lawyers blamed drugs, psychological turmoil, and an internal war over his sexuality. But the case ended with a plea deal, 5 years of probation, mandatory drug rehabilitation, and an order to avoid unsupervised contact with minors. James Brown didn't go on television to denounce him. He didn't give interviews. He did something colder. On tour, he issued a direct order to his team. "Don't let that man open for us. Don't put his records in our playlists. He doesn't stand for funk. He stands for the rot hiding inside those smiling choirs." Yet James's hostility wasn't built only on the headlines. It went deeper to what he saw as a lifelong pattern of repression and hypocrisy. Billy Preston grew up in the church in Houston, Texas, paraded as a child prodigy at the organ, praised as a gift from God. But people close to him later said he was always torn apart inside, caught between his faith and the truth about who he was. There were stories of him falling into deep depression after being quietly pushed aside in church for sitting too close to male dancers. For James Brown, this kind of internal war produced the most dangerous type of man, someone who never dared to live openly, yet couldn't control what he hid inside. And then came 1998. Billy Preston was arrested again, this time not for sex, but for deceit. According to investigators, he was accused of insurance fraud and drug possession. Authorities discovered that he had submitted fake documents for a disability insurance program, claiming he was unable to work while still touring and performing without interruption. At his home, police reportedly found more than 30 pills, white powder, and stacks of questionable medical records. Rumors spread that the insurance money was being used to fund a hidden life, paying for young companions picked up through church gatherings in the Crenshaw area, buying silence one envelope at a time. Nothing was ever fully proven to match the worst whispers. But for James Brown, the pattern was already clear long before the courts moved. Billy Preston, in James's view, was never going to be an explosive scandal like Rick James. He wasn't blasphemous in public like Little Richard. He didn't parade in dresses like Sylvester. And that, James believed, made him more frightening, because Billy was quiet, polished, wrapped in dignity and soft-spoken faith. He hid everything behind a gentle grin, behind songs that moved people, behind a false peace that made the world forget there had ever been a terrified child walking out of his house. James Brown didn't need to scream about him from the stage. He used a quieter weapon: erasure. He simply stopped saying Billy Preston's name. He never cited him as an influence, never honored him in medleys, never allowed him into the mythology he built around funk. And in the backstage code James Brown lived by, that silence was the harshest punishment he could deliver. 6. Sly Stone, when a legend checked into a psychiatric ward. People used to ask, what exactly is Sly Stone? An eccentric genius? A cultural icon? A ghost drifting between LSD and funk? To James Brown, there was no mystery. Sly Stone was madness with a microphone. And that madness, in James's mind, exploded at exactly 3:30 a.m. on the 17th of August 1969 at Woodstock. The festival crowd was exhausted. They had been standing, dancing, and soaking in rain and mud for nearly 24 hours. Bodies slumped on the ground, eyes half shut. Then Sly Stone walked onto the stage. He wore a sequined crop top that flashed under the lights, pink and purple bell-bottoms, glossy lips, and sunglasses so huge they swallowed half his face. He introduced his band with a loose swagger, then grabbed the microphone and shouted, "I want to take you higher." Funk drums collided with psychedelic rock sounds. The stage turned into a storm of rhythm and color. The mostly white audience erupted, screaming, jumping, waving their arms like they were being pulled into another dimension. Meanwhile, the old guard of funk watched from afar, stunned. Funk was supposed to be black. Funk was supposed to be serious. Funk, in James Brown's mind, was not supposed to look like an acid-fueled ritual where men in glitter shrieked like witches. James was touring in Texas at the time. When he later saw the Woodstock footage, he folded his arms, jaw tight, and frowned. "That man is going to kill funk," he reportedly said. "He doesn't understand the weight in every drum beat." But Sly Stone wasn't chasing weight. He was chasing altitude. From the mid-1960 seconds, Sly's image had already started to bend gender rules. He wore animal print tops that looked like dresses, heavy eyeliner, wild afros, sometimes flowers around his neck. He seemed to float between masculine and feminine, between preacher and rebel, between bandleader and hallucination. He didn't go around proclaiming he was gay. He preferred something looser, saying things like, "Music doesn't care about gender. Why should the body?" When people asked whom he loved, he reportedly smiled and said, "I love whoever makes me feel like myself." That was what suffocated James Brown. James lived by control. He controlled every step his dancers took, every horn stab, every costume detail, every drop of sweat that hit the floor. Sly seemed allergic to control. He lived, performed, soared, crashed, and vanished like a raw, unmixed funk track left spinning on a broken turntable. By 1973, the cracks in Sly's mind had begun to show. Bandmates said he talked to speakers as if they were alive. In the middle of rehearsals, he would suddenly demand chord changes because God had just sent him a new pattern. Then came February 1975. In Oakland, Sly stepped on stage, looked out at the crowd, and did nothing. He sat. He stared. 45 minutes passed in near silence. No full song, no show. Just a man suspended somewhere between the stage and a place only he could see. Shortly after, Sly was admitted to San Mateo Psychiatric Hospital. According to medical notes later cited in articles and biographies, he suffered from chronic hallucinations, panic attacks, trouble separating reality from delusion, and signs of long-term neurological damage, likely worsened by cocaine and other drugs. And that was only the beginning. From 1976 to 1982, Sly was hospitalized at least 4 more times. One time he reportedly became convinced someone had hidden a listening device in his afro and refused to let anyone near his hair. Another time he stripped all the clothes out of his hotel room, stuffed them into the minibar refrigerator, and insisted the fabric was talking to him. James Brown had one phrase for it: funk gone mad. But the darkest part of Sly's story, at least in James's eyes, didn't unfold under a spotlight. It unfolded when the spotlight went out. By the early 1990 seconds, fame had dissolved. The man who once electrified Woodstock now moved like a shadow. It was said that Sly Stone lived in a rundown camper parked in a lot behind the Crenshaw district in Los Angeles. When there were no gigs, there was no health insurance. He lived on food stamps, relied on free psychiatric medication from local clinics, and disappeared for long stretches of time. Sometimes, people spotted him sleeping under a Burger King sign, curled around a guitar with no strings. James Brown never attacked him publicly. He didn't need to. When organizers once floated the idea of inviting Sly to perform at a funk tribute show in 1996, James reportedly shut it down immediately. "I don't invite a zombie," he said flatly. There were no tabloid brawls between them, no televised arguments, no headline-grabbing confrontations. This was something colder, a refusal to acknowledge Sly Stone as part of the house James believed he had built. To James, funk required structure, power, discipline. The image of the strong black man carrying his people on his shoulders, sweating under stage lights as if he were dragging the whole world uphill. Sly Stone brought something else onto the stage. Chaos. Chemical chaos. Mental chaos. Gender chaos. He turned performances into rituals where nobody knew what would happen next. Not the band, not the crowd, not even Sly himself. James couldn't stand that, because chaos threatened everything he'd sacrificed to keep funk standing upright. Sly, on the other hand, didn't seem interested in standing upright at all. He just wanted to take people higher than reality, even if he had no way back down. According to later accounts, when Sly Stone died in May 2025, there was no grand public funeral, no massive televised memorial, no enormous stage packed with stars. By then, James Brown had already been dead for nearly 20 years. But if he had still been alive, those who knew him believed he would not have sent flowers, would not have called, would not have recorded a tribute. Because in James Brown's private scripture, Sly Stone had never belonged to funk at all. He wasn't its brother. He was its curse. 7. George Clinton, the unhinged legend who crowned himself president. On the 3rd of April 1976, inside a packed arena in Cincinnati, James Brown arrived backstage earlier than usual to inspect the lights, the sound, the feel of the room. The first thing he saw was not a drum kit or a mic stand. It was a row of high-powered laser cannons mounted on the ceiling, throwing test beams across an empty stage. Then he noticed it. A steaming UFO-shaped structure squatting in the center like it had fallen straight out of a psychedelic nightmare. A technician quietly explained that the spacecraft was not part of James's set. It belonged to George Clinton. It was the mothership. That show, labeled Mothership Connection, was the first time James Brown and George Clinton shared a major bill. It would also be the last. According to crew members who were there, James watched part of the performance, said nothing, and left the venue before it ended. For the next 2 years, his contracts carried a new clause. No shared stage, no joint segments, no integrated performances with George Clinton or any representative of Parliament Funkadelic. Clinton was building his own kingdom, a wild, all-consuming P-Funk empire, using what James Brown later referred to as funk hallucinations. A world where music, lights, bodies, and reality melted together until nothing had clear edges. By 1975, George Clinton had launched an extreme stage costuming era. He wore floral dresses, smeared on green eyeshadow, and draped himself in gender-neutral accessories. The look was described by writers as half drag queen, half prophet, leaving critics unsure if Clinton was leading a funk band, a rock cult, or some strange comedic religion. James Brown had no confusion. In his mind, this wasn't evolution. It was betrayal. Funk, as he defined it, was order, a hard, disciplined rhythm. Clinton shattered that structure, and the worst part to James was that audiences cheered him for it. What began as a quiet resentment slowly solidified into absolute disgust when Clinton's life started to unravel in public. On the 19th of September 1982, a show in Boston fell apart at the last minute. According to internal venue reports, Clinton had taken a heavy dose of drugs before the performance. Backstage, he sat alone in the dressing room, drawing symbols on his own face with a marker and telling staff that he was the president of the 8th planet. A few months later, on the 11th of February 1983, 3 major venues blacklisted George Clinton. The reasons, according to internal memos, were always the same: backstage chaos, missing equipment, technical staff complaining of being assaulted, and suspicions that rehearsals and meetings were secretly being recorded so Clinton could use conversations as organic samples in his next projects. From 1984 to 1988, George Clinton seemed to vanish from mainstream sight. Those who claimed to stay close to him painted a bleak picture. A man bouncing between 3 half-abandoned warehouses in Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, recording on old, patched gear, selling away chunks of his catalog for quick cash. In a contract dated the 6th of May 1987, it was reported that Clinton sold the rights to Funkadelic's first 4 albums for just $8,000. Decades later, those same rights would be valued at over $1 million. Then came the lawsuits. In 1993, George Clinton unexpectedly sued several former producers, demanding control over his author's rights after years of tangled deals. After a long legal struggle, he partially won a ruling on the 2nd of April 1998, recovering some of what he claimed had been taken from him. But that legal victory sparked a new firestorm. 3 former members of Parliament Funkadelic filed complaints accusing Clinton of fraud, of withholding royalties, of signing contracts in the names of fictional characters, aliases like Sir Nose or Starchild, entities that didn't exist outside of album lore. Courts struggled to process many of these accusations for lack of hard proof. But public opinion had already split. James Brown didn't need a judge's verdict. For him, the story was finished. From that point on, every tour choreography document James approved reportedly carried a quiet command. Avoid anything that smells like Clinton. No purple laser clouds. No cartoonish space hats. No mothership references. As the 2000s arrived, George Clinton slowly re-emerged. He appeared on television shows like Chappelle's Show, was praised by rising hip-hop artists as a founding father, and was sampled on tracks that made new stars out of his old riffs. Meanwhile, his personal finances were wrecked. It was said he sometimes slept in his car, parked outside an Atlanta studio. No active bank account, hundreds of thousands of dollars in tax debt. A legend living like an unpaid session musician. And yet, the public still called him the funk survivor. They saw the Technicolor hair, the ridiculous hats, the chant, "Free your mind and your ass will follow." They didn't see the paperwork. They didn't see the addictions, the legal traps, the guardianships. To James Brown, that was the final insult. George Clinton hadn't just survived everything that should have destroyed an artist. He survived without changing, without apologizing, without making a visible, public sacrifice. He walked through fire and came out still playing the Clown King, still adored, still labeled a genius. In James Brown's world, that wasn't art. It was a mockery of responsibility. And yet, the story doesn't end with one man. Here they are, laid out like a sealed file. The 7 men James Brown was said to despise most. Not because they were weak, not because they lacked brilliance, but because they chose to live in ways he could never accept. A drag icon singing gospel in sequins. A self-proclaimed funk priest drowning in sex and drugs. A genius who claimed to find inspiration watching others have sex. A shape-shifting rock pioneer who never stopped changing his story. A church-trained prodigy accused of harming the very innocence he once played for. A shattered visionary sleeping in a van with a head full of noise. A cosmic bandleader who sold pieces of his empire for crumbs, then came back as if nothing had happened. And all of them were black men. James Brown tried to make funk serious. A weapon, a discipline, a code of survival. They turned it into a launchpad for chaos, blurred gender, scandal, and, in his eyes, outright sin. But beneath all the anger, one question still hangs in the air like feedback at the end of a show. Who truly kept funk alive? Was it the Godfather, the man who wrote the rules and died guarding them? Or was it the wild, broken, unapologetic figures he hated? The ones who bent the rules until they snapped and dragged funk into places he never wanted it to go? What do you believe? Was James Brown right to resent them? Or was he simply raging at a future he couldn't control?